Beautiful. So because my ordination anniversary doesn't fall on Sundays very often, I want to take just a moment to reminisce. A couple of things you may or may not know. First of all, 28 years after my ordination, Sally Fahrenthal, a Lutheran minister, and I, before she passed last year or 2 years ago maybe, got together to talk about which one of us was the first woman to serve in Wichita. And we finally decided that I was here first as the first minister, but she was here as the first ordained minister. So we both can claim first in Wichita. Secondly, when I was ordained, I was very intentional about including both men and women, all different races in my ordination service, and ecumenical partners. And I wanted to be sure that one person didn't ask the ordination questions, as typically was done, but that my ordination vows were presented by people across the spectrum. So I had a United Methodist minister ask a question about ecumenicism, and I had a black minister ask about my racial intention to include people of all different races, and I had women ask about my intention to include people of all genders and gender expressions in ministry, and so on down the row, so that I could promise and vow to have a social justice ministry and make those vows to people who were in those populations. And that was kind of a new and different thing. I also had a couple preach my ordination service, not just one person from the seminary, and that was new and different. In fact, the woman who was part of the couple had never preached an ordination sermon before. So it was a lot of fun and very different, and some people still have blisters on their behinds because it took 2 hours to ordain me. But it was a great time, and I'm very grateful to my partner, Eric, for being the single parent he was for the 2.5 years it took for me to commute to seminary before people commuted to seminary, because at the time, seminary was an in-person process, and now they're much more accommodating to people who travel. But at any rate, it was quite an experience and a beautiful thing that we got to do. And for ministers, for many of us, ordination is every bit as important as a marriage ceremony. So thanks for letting me reminisce a bit. In the Hindu Vedas, we find a parable that many of you may not have heard of called the rope and the snake. A man walks along at night on a path, and he sees what he thinks is a poisonous snake. It's barring his way, and so he turns and he runs in the opposite direction. And as he returns along the same path later in the morning, in daylight, he finds not a snake, but a coiled rope on the ground. And he realizes that in the darkness, he mistook the coiled rope as a snake. And it dawns on him, in the dark, it is hard to see reality. But in the light of day, he can see much more clearly. Our perception of reality can be clouded in darkness, which is ignorance to reality. And this ignorance sometimes can manifest as rapid judgment or as fear. And we react solely based on our senses or our emotion. A common example of seeing the snake instead of the rope is when we're asked to meet, say, with our boss. And if we have to wait a few hours to dwell on it before we meet with our boss, our mind can go all over the place. What did I do? What does he or she want? Am I in trouble? But is there really any indication of trouble? Have we done something wrong for real? Expecting the worst in that situation is seeing the snake. But when you see the snake in any situation, it's important to stop, take a breath, and think back to the outcomes in this scenario. Think back to your prior meetings with the boss. Do you have any real reason for concern based on previous meetings? Try to breathe slowly and see the rope. Another common example could be coming home to your partner and he or she doesn't greet you as joyfully as you were accustomed. Maybe he or she is a little terse. The snake would say in your mind, what have I done this time? Or, why are you mad at me? Often people are curt with us, and it has nothing to do with us at all. That particular snake in our mind is ego. What an easy way to get into an argument. But stopping and again taking a breath might lead to a response on our part more like, did you have a rough day, or do you want to talk about it? And then we can find the true cause of the disturbance instead of escalating the reactivity in our situation. Now, according to the Vedas, the purpose of philosophy, of thinking about things, is to disarm the fear of the world by removing the threat of the unknown. Knowledge of the truth about the world makes the world less fearsome and more bearable. As I think about the increasing polarization in our country over the last several years, leading up to the insurrection in our capital, I realize that one of the dangerous reasons our citizenry is so hostile is a lack of agreement about what is true. Some see snakes and some see ropes. We are not using, for example, a common media source for truth, and we do not understand or see realities of our lives with the same understandings. Until we do, we all need to take a step back and breathe. Otherwise, fear will overtake us. I have to admit that I thought long and hard about scrapping this whole sermon series based on the book by Will Willimon called Fear of the Other, There is No Fear in Love. After what happened, I thought about canceling the sermon series starting last week. And then I decided that this was an important time for this sermon series, that we need to understand why we're so afraid of the other. Is there anything more natural, more innate, more universal than our fear of the other? The Bible addresses this fear early on, shortly after creation of humanity itself. That pesky book of laws. I don't know anyone who likes this book of the Bible, Leviticus. The Hebrew people are instructed as follows from Leviticus 19, verses 33 and 34. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Well, it's unnatural enough to be told by Jesus later in the Bible to love your neighbor as yourself. But to love even the foreigner, to love, not to like, not to accept, but to love the foreigner seems to be a stretch. My Bible commentary calculates that the Hebrew Bible, we often refer to it as the Old Testament, warns the people 36 times about our obligation to immigrants. 36 times. Most of those texts are accompanied by a reason that our ancestors were once immigrants too, delivered from oppression by God. In Leviticus, it goes on to say, to be holy is not to be narrow-minded or prim or proper, but to imitate God. To be holy is to act as God acts. Because God welcomes all, we are to welcome all. We're to throw the doors open. In Leviticus, if you want to be holy, don't go knocking door to door like some people do, telling people about God's love. Actually, act like God does. Love your neighbor. Show hospitality to a stranger. Be a person of justice. That's what Leviticus tells us. This lesson is taught repeatedly in the Bible, by law, by prophets, by Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus said, and I'm quoting again, Matthew 25:35, "For I was hungry and you gave me food." These are action verbs. "I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me." Now, the Greek word for stranger in this text is xenos. The same Greek word is used later in Ephesians. "So then, you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God." Xenos in Greek includes foreigners, immigrants, strangers. Ephesians proclaims that the new Christians, the Gentiles, are now included in the list of xenos. Those who are outside are now fellow citizens with God's people. It is from this Greek word, xenos, that we get the word xenophobia, the fear of the other. According to Will Willimon, the theologian whose book we are following for this series about fear of the other, xenophobia is not only historical, it's also biological. He cites the fight or flight syndrome that most of you know about. It's how we decide quickly whether a situation or a person is a possible threat, and either we move toward them or we move quickly away from them. Now, of course, you know that evolution is hardwired into our brains, and it comes from the days of cavemen and women. It's how to be cautious or self-protective, which of course made sense in a time when our survival was threatened daily in the wilderness. But in our modern urban world, those valuable coping mechanisms are the source of some of the most damaging mistakes of judgment, and also irrational fear and false consciousness of the other. Today, we live in an interconnected, interdependent world. That friend or foe fear can actually be a great burden to us. An example of this is that clear thinking and accurate judgment are needed in order to distinguish a frightened, innocent, suffering Syrian refugee from a hate-filled, murderous Syrian jihadist. But if we use our fear and not our reason, all Syrians become like the snake in the dark to us. It requires reason to stop and discern whether the snake could be a rope. Does that make sense? Not fight or flight, reason. Scott Bayer Say, in his book Following Jesus in a Culture of Fear, which was published in 2007, notes that the top killers in the U.S. are actually heart disease, cancer, and stroke. But, this is important, what do we think and worry about as top killers? Not heart disease, cancer, and stroke. Our fears that we will die from are terrorists, pedophiles, plane crashes, mad cow disease, and bird flu. That's in 2007. It will have changed by now. But the point is still the same. Our worries and our fears about things that aren't our top killers, right? Here are some other facts from his book. Though crime rates were dropping then, 2/3 of the people thought that they were rising. And the population most afraid of victimization by violence was the population least victimized by violent crime. Young adult males are the most vulnerable, but seniors were the ones most concerned about dying by violent crime. Another point, a major justification for the purchase of a firearm is self-defense against bad people. However, most handgun deaths are gun accidents by a friend or a family member, a domestic dispute, or suicide by someone's own hand. So what we worry about is often the exact opposite of what actually happens. So my point is, as thinking people of faith, we are called to use our God-given brains to reason through our fears to achieve a greater sense of overall well-being. And knowing that we have choices regarding fear is a power antidote to that fear. This includes our response to the sedition of right-wing fundamentalists. Our negative expectations tend to magnify the threat of the other. It is not that we should turn a blind eye to destructive behavior, but our worry and our fear is not constructive behavior either. If we can be constructive, then our action can be productive. If our fear overrides our constructive action, then the rope turns into a snake. If our fear overrides our action, then the rope has turned into a snake. So here's the good news, because a sermon is always to be good news. Humans need positive social connection. We need these spiritually and biologically. Numerous studies have shown that a powerful transformer of our experience with others is expectation. For example, when a patient is told by a physician that a procedure won't hurt a bit, you've all heard that, right? That patient reports actually half as much pain as the same patients who were told, now you're going to experience some pain from this procedure, for the exact same procedure. So the doctor who tells the patient, this won't hurt a bit, actually helps his or her patients. Okay? Expectation actually alters our neurochemical brain activity. Positive expectations bring our brains joy as powerful a dose as morphine. Seriously, that's a scientific factor. And likewise, the expectation of the other affects our experience of the other. Expectation of the other affects our experience of the other. But the converse is also true. When we expect a positive response, but we receive less than we expect, our dopamine level falls, and we get disappointed and sometimes even angry. Wonder why your spouse sometimes acts the way he or she does and you don't understand? Think about their dopamine levels and their expectations. If they had high expectations and you don't perform at that level, you don't meet their expectations, their anger, their frustration is because their dopamine levels fall in disappointment. Remember that I said humans are made for social interactions? Studies show that shaking hands, swapping names, discussing something you have in common, it actually increases our OxyContin levels. Studies also show that human happiness, particularly studies on successful aging, show that the key element is social connectedness. But fear, like the fear of leaving our own homes to move into a retirement center, or the fear of being the new person, can hinder us from exercising our full humanity. So let me close with this. As your pastor, I would like you to each think this week about when in your life you have felt like the other and how it felt. And then I would like you to think about how you might reach out with a predetermined expectation to an other. I know it's COVID, so reaching out might not be physical. It might be on the phone. But reaching out to another and offering hospitality. How would you reach out to someone who is an other? And then offer hospitality to them. Because there is no fear in love. Amen.